All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of the webinar series of Latin America Interest Group at ASO. Today, we have a very distinguished guest for our webinar, Dr. Juan Pablo Scarfi, who is going to talk to us about his book, The Hidden History of International Law in the Americas, Empire and Legal Networks. It's a book that was published in 2017 by Oxford University Press, and it's basically the result of Juan Pablo's research over a number of years at Cambridge University, if I'm not mistaken, in which Juan Pablo looks at the intellectual history of what became known as American international law in the Western Hemisphere. And it's a book that has been celebrated, much discussed around the continent. So it's quite a privilege for us to be able to have Juan Pablo giving a talk about his book in English, which will hopefully make it known to an even wider audience than it is already known to. So without further ado, welcome Juan Pablo, and the floor, or rather the camera, is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to present my recent book, The Hidden History of International Law in the Americas, Empire and Legal Networks, which has been reviewed in several journals and different languages, including in Spanish and English and French more recently. The Hidden History of International Law in the Americas and Paralegal Networks offers a history, an intellectual history, essentially, of the idea of American international law in the Western Hemisphere. And the history of international law can be seen, on the one hand, as the history of the imperial of projects that sought to legitimize international law through civilizing mission. And at the same time, the history of international law can be seen as an attempt to provincialize, adapt international law to continental projects. In recent years, essentially in the last 15 years, there has been a revival and a vibrant literature on the history of international law, which has led to explore many scholars, a number of scholars, to explore the connections between international law and empire and the roots, the colonial and imperial roots of international law. But there has been very little work on and very little interest on a different aspect of international law, which I have just emphasized, which is the attempt to adapt and provincialize international law according to continental and regional concerns. So the Hidden History of International Law offers a history of the deployment of international law for the legitimization of U.S. hemispheric ascendancy in the context of the emergence of the United States as an informant empire in the Americas, and also the origins of the so-called inter-American system. The book also explores the important encounter, mutual understanding, but also eventual separation between two prominent international lawyers of the Americas, James Frank Scott, a prominent international lawyer of the United States, founder of the American Society of International Law, and Alejandro Alvarez from Chile, who is legal advisor of the Chilean Minister of Foreign Affairs, and both epitomize, and was a Chilean international lawyer, and both epitomize US and Latin American visions of international law, and both joined together to create a continental legal organization for the advancement of a common unitary hemispheric approach to what they both term American international law, that is to say, a continental understanding of international law in the Western Hemisphere. The book concentrates on the golden years of Pan-Americanism and more specifically on the trajectory of the American Institute of International Law, a Pan-American organization founded by these two international lawyers and devoted to construct, develop, and codify American international law. The American Institute was financially supported by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it joined together and coordinates the works of all the national societies of international law of the Americas that were created right at the time when the American Institute began to coordinate them. And actually, the American Institute put forward the process of creating this series of national societies of international law. Was part of the project of the American Institute itself. The book also explores the international legal thought of a number of jurists of the Americas, and also diplomats and intellectuals of the Americas, including Alejandro Álvarez, James Brown Scott, but also Luis María Drago from Argentina, Antonio Sánchez de Bustamante from Cuba, Elliot Root from the United States, Secretary of the Department of State, Víctor Manuel Murtuda from Peru, and Carlos Abela Lamas from Argentina, as well as Charles Evan Hughes, Secretary of State as well. The attempt to provincialize, and one can say as one of the findings of the book is that, and conclusions or tentative conclusions of the book is that the attempt to provincialize and adapt international law to continental concerns to some extent succeeded in that the projects of the American Institute of International Law contributed to create and consolidate inter-American multilateralism, the principle of non-intervention, the consolidation of sovereign equality, especially in the context of the Montevideo Conference of 1933, and that was a product of the process of codification of private and public international law put forward by the American Institute of International Law. But also one can say that this the scope of this success was partial, in that also the American Institute contributed to consolidate U.S. hegemony in the construction of international law in the Americas. In that it extend and Pan-Americanized U.S.-led conceptions of international law, and it contributed to extend and Pan-Americanize U.S. exceptionalism to the Americas as a whole. One of the most important arguments, indeed, of the book is that American international law, as advanced by the American Institute of International Law, was driven by a U.S. led imperial aspiration of civilizing Latin America through the promotion of international rule of law. The arguments of the book, one can summarize them by emphasizing an aspect that I think is essential for understanding the evolution of international law in the Americas, and is that the organization and the language of American international law found important limitations for moderating, as I mentioned, U.S. hegemony and promoting power balancing in the Americas. And this is because some of the choices and practices that prevail within the American Institute were to some extent elitist and U.S.-led attitudes, and essentially the book is a book that emphasizes not just only the intellectual history of the American Institute, but also emphasizes some of the choices and practices that prevail within the Institute. Essentially, the American Institute institutionalized itself by the attempt of James Brown Scott, its president, to engage with Cuban conservative international lawyers who were supportive of the Platt Amendment, And this also contributed to displace Alejandro Alvarez from the American Institute in the 1920s. And this the title of the book gives an idea of these choices that, as I mentioned, were U.S.-led choices that also were based on alliances with Cuban conservative international lawyers. And essentially, this is a book essentially about ideologies and discursive analysis of American international law, but also emphasizes the practices within the American Institute. I mean, this is a hidden history because if one were to write an intellectual history that is only a discursive history, probably the history would have been a more teleological history that would probably have emphasized how the American Institute of International Law contributed to the consolidation of inter-American multilateralism. But the idea of putting forward a hidden history contributes to shed light into some of the hidden beliefs, the hidden practices that prevail within the Institute, that were to some extent elitist, ethnocentric, and hegemonic, that contributed to some extent to consolidate civilizing imperial aspirations that were underlying some of the beliefs and projects of the organization, specifically oriented the organization, the American Institute of International Law, to the deployment, extension, and Pan-Americanization of U.S. legal and political values as the standard of civilization for the Americas as a whole. The book has 3 levels of analysis, and the subtitle of the book provides an idea of these 3 levels. In parallel legal networks, there is a middle level of analysis, which concerns the American Institute of International Law as a legal network, and how this legal network that joined together a number of international lawyers of the Americas operated. Above this middle level, there is the level of U.S. the relationship of power politics between the United States and Latin America, that also contributed to shape this legal network, but not in a way determining how these institute and legal network operated, but shaping how the legal network operated, and the fact that the United States provided the funds, and the American Endowment for International Peace provided the funds for contributing to create this legal network, also contributed to shape this and this relationship of power politics, and the consolidation of the American Institute in Washington contribute to this level above the legal network, which concerns the financial aspects of the legal network, but also the relationship of power politics. And below the legal network, we can see a series of individuals that contributed to a great extent to shape the logics and internal politics of the legal network, and the contribution of individuals is emphasized to a large extent in the book, to the extent that the international law contribute to the dissolution of the American Institute of International Law was Carlos Saavedra Lamas, and so the scope of individual agency for the development and evolution of the American Institute was also essential, as I show in the book. And as I mentioned, the American Institute of International Law was joined together a group of jurists and politicians and diplomats who share a series of common principles, but adopted different approaches for defending these principles. All these jurists joined together in the American Institute, believe and share a conception of the world oriented towards of world politics, oriented towards a liberal international legal approach, and a series of principles were defended by most of the members of the American Institute of International Law, essentially associated to US hegemony and leadership in the continent, such as the Monroe Doctrine, Pan-American Solidarity. Pan-Americanism was a US-led movement, the idea of hemispheric peace, and also the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment, as you know, legitimized in the context of and this was included in the Cuban Constitution, the intervention of the United States in Cuba on a regular basis between 1901 up to 1934, and none of the members of the American Institute questioned the legitimacy of the Platt Amendments, and the American Institute also, most of the members shared an idea of condemning violence and arbitrary interventions, and also most of them shared the idea that it was important to protect the lives and properties of foreigners located abroad, and this had to do essentially with US properties and individuals located in Latin American countries. However, there has been a tension between the approach of some of the members of the American Institute who were more ethnocentric, hegemonic, and pragmatic, such as James Frank Scott and Elliot Root and Víctor Manuel Murtua and Antonio Sánchez de Bustamante, and the visions essentially defended by Alejandro Álvarez, who adopted a solidarist, multilateral, and idealist approach to international law, and essentially this led eventually to the dissolution of the American Institute. These tensions created a great scope for dissolving the mission of the American Institute. To give you a very brief overview of the conclusions and findings of the book, one can say that Latin American and US jurists held common liberal international aspirations about peace, sovereign equality, moderate defense of non-intervention, and neutrality in principle. However, all these jurists sought to provincialize international law through two different approaches, and one can add a third one. The first one, as I mentioned, was a US-led elitist and multilateral pragmatic approach to international law in defense of humanitarian interventions, and most of the jurists who defended this approach were, well, essentially, as I mentioned, James Frank Scott, Víctor Manuel Murtua, Antonio Sánchez de Bustamante, Charles Evan Hughes, and Elliot Root. A second vision, and this was epitomized by Alejandro Álvarez, emphasized a multilateral approach to international law based on a robust idea of continental solidarity, a moderate approach to non-intervention, and the idea that Pan-Americanism would eventually lead and prompt the United States to stop intervening in the Americas in the long run. This approach was adopted by Alejandro Álvarez, but also by Luis Anderson, who was the treasurer of the American Institute, a Costa Rican international lawyer. And finally, there was a third approach, essentially a South American defensive, radically anti-interventionist approach, and one can say also a non-Pan-American and even anti-Pan-American approach, and it was defended by Carlos Saavedra Lamas, who contributed in 1933 in the context of the Montevideo Conference to the dissolution of the American Institute. So provincializing and continentalizing international law can be seen as an attempt to define the place of US and Latin America and within world politics, and this was a trend towards multilateral practices, towards emphasizing solidarism, and also contributing to the codification of private and public international law, and condemning violent interventions, and consolidating to some extent multilateral practices. And essentially, one can summarize that one of the findings of the book, in the extent to which the book is a history, or if you like, the history of the roots of the Inter-American legal system, one can see the debates within the American Institute of International Law about non-intervention on the one hand, and defending robust ideas of human rights and American international law, were ideals that clash with one another, but at the same time found their roots, and one can say that these two features and long-standing features of Latin American international law and US international law within the Inter-American system had resonances until the present day for understanding international law in the Western Hemisphere, and for understanding the evolution and current trajectory of the Inter-American system as such, and looking at these past debates about non-intervention and the promotion of human rights and international law are essential features of American international law and the Inter-American system as such. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy reading the book.